New at 6 o'clock, uproar and confusion tonight as state lawmakers move to change rules requiring Duke Energy to recycle coal ash currently stored in those unlined ash ponds.
Yeah, the move to change the rules comes just weeks before a key deadline for Duke. Investigative reporter Nick Oxner has spent the day trying to figure out what's happening and why.
Last year, the General Assembly passed rules requiring Duke Energy to pick plants where it would dig up coal ash from its ponds and recycle it into concrete. Two of those plants, including the Buck Steam Station in Salisbury, were announced in January. Duke is supposed to announce the third plant in just a few weeks, on July 1st. But new last-minute legislation pushed through a Senate committee today could change that.
Underneath this seemingly tranquil lake next to Buck Steam Station near Salisbury sits millions of tons of coal ash. That ash has become the subject of a years-long controversy, accused of contaminating nearby drinking water wells. Earlier this year, Duke Energy agreed to dig that ash up and turn it into material that can be recycled into concrete.
1 year ago, we had legislation passed that said we would have this coal ash recycled into concrete, which is a great way to take care of this problem and provide the material we need for the booming growth that we have.
Catawba Riverkeeper Sam Perkins was among the environmental advocates that cheered legislation passed last year requiring Duke to recycle some of its coal ash. But now, Perkins is concerned by new language suddenly added into a Senate bill today that would push back the deadline by which Duke has to start recycling that ash, and even do away with the recycling requirement altogether if the company determines it's not economically feasible.
We have plenty of coal ash. We are currently importing it, though, from Asia because we have such a demand. So the last thing we need to do is be allowing the coal ash that we have to be capped in place. It really needs to be recycled.
A spokeswoman for Duke Energy said the company's committed to excavating and recycling coal ash at the Buck Steam Station near Salisbury and another plant near Goldsboro, and said the company would do whatever is required by law if and when it has to name a third plant at which it will recycle ash.
Excavating the coal ash and putting it into concrete is much cheaper than taking it to another lined landfill somewhere. And it also removes the material that can, and what models show, will continue to leach into groundwater and drinking water reservoirs.
Now, legislative staff confirmed today that the Senate committee considering changing that July deadline approved doing so in a committee meeting this morning. But details on what was actually voted on still haven't been made public. And the senator who chaired this morning's committee meeting did not return multiple calls seeking an explanation for why this proposal to change a deadline was suddenly put forth. Guys, back to you.
Breaking news right now surrounding the debate over safe drinking water for some of our neighbors. The North Carolina Department of Environmental Quality issued new rules last Friday that would allow homeowners who use private water wells to drink water with elevated levels of a toxic element that has been at the center of a controversy.
But investigative reporter Nick Oxner has just obtained a memo from experts at the state's Department of Health and Human Services calling that decision into question. Nick is live right now. He's in the newsroom with what he's uncovered. Hey, Nick.
Yeah, Molly, Paul, the debate is over a toxic chemical called hexavalent chromium. It's commonly associated with coal ash, and it's what prompted state regulators to tell residents near Duke coal ash ponds in Salisbury and Belmont to stop drinking their water about 2 years ago. Since that time, lawmakers passed a bill requiring Duke Energy to pay for new, alternate water sources to be given to those homeowners with elevated levels of hexavalent chromium. But late Friday, DEQ announced new rules that would allow for higher elements of that toxic chemical to be in homeowners' drinking water by more than 10 times what state scientists have said is safe. We've obtained this memo drafted by epidemiologists at the State Department of Health and Human Services, responding to DEQ's decision to set a higher standard than the one used to issue those do not drink letters in 2015. It says DHHS will continue using the tougher standard, even though DEQ has chosen not to. Now, I just got a joint statement from spokesmen for both DEQ and DHHS, literally as I was standing here waiting to bring you guys this story. It says in part that these new performance standards protect public health by meeting or exceeding federal drinking water standards, and that .07 standard has not been made into law. It's just a policy at DHHS. We'll post that full statement online at WBTV.com. Guys, for now, back to you.
Breaking news tonight in the ongoing saga over water standards for residents who live near coal ash ponds. State regulators announced a new panel of scientists will determine acceptable limits for a dangerous chemical found in drinking water near coal ash facilities. The announcement comes just a day after WBTV's investigation uncovered a disagreement between health scientists and environmental regulators. Our investigative reporter Nick Oxner is in our newsroom to explain.
Regulators at the State Department of Environmental Quality and the Department of Health and Human Services announced today that a science panel would review the standards for how much of a toxic chemical known as hexavalent chromium can be in drinking water. That chemical was made famous by the movie Erin Brockovich, and it's become the center of debate here in North Carolina because people who live close enough to Duke coal ash ponds have elevated levels of the toxic chemical in their water.
People in places like Salisbury and Belmont have been living off bottled water for 2 years, ever since state health regulators told them their water was unsafe to drink. More than 150 residents near Duke coal ash ponds got letters saying their water contained elevated levels of a chemical called hexavalent chromium. Anything more than 0.07 parts per billion was unsafe. Last year, the state legislature passed a law requiring Duke to either run those residents' permanent water lines or give them filters. And late last week, DEQ said those filters only have to filter the water down to 10 parts per billion, way more than the limit set by state scientists in 2015.
I think it was really just to let everyone know that we had made a decision on those performance standards to give Duke Energy some guidance on the design of the water filtration system.
Regulators defended their decision on a conference call with reporters Wednesday night, just a day after WBTV unearthed this memo written by state scientists at DHHS saying the new DEQ standard does not protect residents from increased cancer risks.
We also wanted to dispel the notion that the agencies are at odds.
Now, regulators say they'll ask a panel of scientists to review the new standard for the toxic chemical and determine a safe drinking level.
Why did you go ahead and issue that guidance without first convening this panel to evaluate a standard within that guidance?
Well, it's really just balancing statutory deadlines.
Now, regulators at the two agencies say they're still working to appoint people to that panel that will review these standards. They say that review should be complete by the end of the year. Guys, back to you.
North Carolina Governor Roy Cooper says controversial rules handed down by his administration earlier this month regarding water safety are not final. Cooper's remarks were prompted by questions from a WBTV investigation that uncovered a memo from state health scientists. That memo took issue with the new standards set by the state's Department of Environmental Quality, regulating the amount of a toxic chemical that can be in drinking water. Our investigative reporter Nick Oxner has pressing the state leaders. He has been for answers. He joins us live right now and has more. Nick?
Yeah, Paul, nearly 2 weeks ago, the Department of Environmental Quality handed down new guidelines that said Duke Energy could give water filters to people living near coal ash ponds. The guidelines didn't specifically limit a chemical called hexavalent chromium, which is the same toxic chemical from the movie Erin Brockovich. State health scientists have called that decision a mistake.
That's it right there.
When Barbara Morales moved into her house in Belmont, the water she drank came from this concrete hole in the ground. For a decade, she used the water to drink, cook, and bathe. But then that stopped.
How long has it been since you drank the water from that well?
Over 2 years.
Now, Barbara's forced to use bottled water, which is piled high in her yard. All because her well contains elevated levels of a toxic chemical called hexavalent chromium.
This is a known carcinogenic. It's been proven.
Last year, the North Carolina General Assembly passed a bill requiring Duke Energy to either connect Morales and her neighbors to a public water line or install a filtration system in their homes to filter the toxic chemicals associated with coal ash sitting in Duke's ponds. Scientists at the North Carolina Department of Health and Human Services say water with more than 0.07 parts per billion of hexavalent chromium is too dangerous to drink. But earlier this month, DEQ issued a new rule saying the new filtration systems installed by Duke only had to filter down to 10 parts per billion of the toxic chemical.
Do you trust what people at DEQ and DHHS are doing to protect you?
No, I'm hoping they will.
Last week, a WBTV investigation uncovered this memo written by DHHS health scientists saying the new DEQ standard wasn't safe. A day later, leaders from the two agencies announced a new science review panel would study the issue and determine a safe level for hexavalent chromium. Our request for an interview with leaders from the two agencies were ultimately denied. We took them to Governor Roy Cooper.
Career health officials at DHHS and the McCrory administration, and again since you've taken office, have said that the only way to prevent increased exposure to cancer-causing elements is that 0.07 parts per billion hexavalent chromium level. Do you think that's the standard that DEQ should adopt?
Well, I think DEQ is listening to the Department of Health and Human Services, and I've instructed both of them to work together.
DHHS scientists told DEQ in an April memo that the standards they wanted to set were not health preventive safe. And then in July, DEQ set that standard anyway. So it doesn't sound like DEQ is listening to the career scientists.
Well, they are working together in setting up this science advisory board. I think the leaders of both departments realize that health officials and scientists all need to get together to come up with a final solution to this. And I don't think that we are at a final solution.
But for now, the new rules put in place by DEQ will remain on the books. And that worries neighbors like Barbara Morales, who are dealing with the consequences of the bureaucratic back and forth, one bottle of water at a time.
They need to pay attention to what's going on back here at home.
You feel like they've forgotten about you?
Yeah. I haven't heard either one of them mention a thing about Duke or this. Not a thing.
Now, this new science review panel has not yet been formed, but officials with DEQ and DHHS say its work will be finished by the end of the year. Guys, back to you.
Live from Charlotte, this is WBTV News, on your side.
Now only on WBTV, editing the truth on coal ash. Our investigation has uncovered emails that show Duke Energy made changes to a scientific report.
I recognize that text that you're reading, and I wrote that.
How can you sit here in front of me and tell me that this email with these documents is something that you wrote when we have the evidence that that's not true?
Tonight, internal documents uncovered by WBTV are exposing the relationship between Duke Energy and the scientists paid by the company to research coal ash. Good evening. I'm Maureen O'Boyle.
And I'm Paul Cameron. For years, Duke has pointed to reports by 2 professors at UNC Charlotte as scientific evidence to support their assertion that coal ash does not contaminate groundwater, among other things. Duke has called the scientists' work independent. Now, documents uncovered by our investigative reporter Nick Oxner suggest the professor's work is anything but.
See how they changed the words? Look at that. And look at that. Look how much they added here.
Deborah Graham and Amy Brown are flipping through pages they say prove what they've suspected for years, as they've been forced to live off bottled water and fight against Duke's coal ash ponds right in their own backyards.
Their edit, arsenic was not detected. Who's the expert here?
What they're looking at is this email and a draft of this report written by a professor at UNC Charlotte for Duke Energy. Dr. Bill Langley was hired by Duke to study the impacts of coal ash on groundwater. This email from an engineer at Duke attaches a copy of Langley's report with highly suggested edits that appear to make substantial changes to the report.
That's not independent.
No, but we've always known that. We've always known.
We have.
We have always known that.
Yes.
But now this is proof, Amy.
This is proof. It just backs up what we've always
Duke continuously wants us to trust them and tells everybody to trust us, and we're here for you, and we're doing this out of being a good neighbor. But no, this isn't being a good neighbor.
That email and its highly suggested edits are just one example of what we found in thousands of pages of documents provided to WBTV by UNC Charlotte in response to a public records request. They show a pattern of Langley consulting with engineers and executives at the company as he conducted coal ash research.
They were given an opportunity to review that, and they made some edits to the text that was included in that summary that just made that summary more concise.
Langley rejects the notion that he let Duke Energy control his research, even as we showed him the email and report with Duke's edits.
That all sounds like my language.
Sir, this is added by Duke in the track changes and the highly suggested edits. This was added by Duke.
I recognize that text that you're reading, and I wrote that.
How can you sit here in front of me and tell me that this email with these documents is something that you wrote when we have the evidence that that's not true?
Now, I guess I haven't really seen, I don't acknowledge that that's evidence.
Independent scientists, not so much. They are definitely relying on Duke Energy for funding and doing work that Duke Energy has asked them to do.
DJ Gherkin is an attorney at the Southern Environmental Law Center. He's involved in lawsuits against Duke Energy involving the company's coal ash ponds.
Duke has hired consultants at private firms and at UNC Charlotte to answer the questions it wants answered. Unfortunately, those questions are self-serving for Duke Energy.
But Duke Energy spokeswoman Paige Sheehan denied the company has ever done anything wrong.
I think you're misleading people and misrepresenting robust scientific study that went through exactly the kind of review process that you would expect in any kind of research like this.
Deborah Graham and Amy Brown say this report and thousands of other documents uncovered by WBTV is more proof the company's hiding behind science it knows isn't true.
We've known for a long time that Duke is not been very truthful. And
you can't trust them. I mean,
you can't trust them.
Trusting Duke is dangerous to our health.
Now, in addition to the research reports prepared by Dr. Langley and edited by Duke, we found a second UNCC professor leading a so-called independent review board paid for by Duke Energy while helping the company craft its message for regulators at the same time. Guys, we'll have that part of our story tomorrow night at 6.
Certainly a long way from over, Nick.
Yes, our investigation continues.
All right, thanks so much.
New tonight, our investigation into the ties between Duke Energy and scientists paid by the company to research coal ash continues. We first told you last night about edits Duke made to a scientific report about coal ash.
The scientists behind that work claim to be working independently of the energy conglomerate, and so does a second professor who chairs a national advisory board created by Duke. But emails obtained by our investigative reporter Nick Oxer suggest otherwise.
Duke Energy's worked for years to figure out what to do with millions of tons of coal ash buried in ash ponds around North Carolina. It's agreed to excavate and move some of the ash to lined landfills. The company's fighting to keep others buried underground through a process known as cap in place. As it's navigated that process, the company's turned to advice from a group of scientists on the National Ash Management Advisory Board.
The people on that board are independent from Duke Energy.
UNC Charlotte professor John Daniels chairs that board. He wrote this letter in April 2016 to the North Carolina Department of Environmental Quality advocating against the state applying risk classifications to any of Duke's coal ash ponds. In the letter, Daniels goes out of his way to outline the fact that his board is independent of Duke.
You want a board to be independent, objective, and detached from corporate momentum.
But emails obtained by WBTV shows Daniels has consulted with Duke Energy while chairing the advisory board he claims is independent of the company. Take this calendar invite from April 13th of 2016, 1 week after Daniels' letter to DEQ spelling out his independence. It shows Daniels met with top executives at Duke to discuss an upcoming presentation to regulators at DEQ.
Best I can tell from looking at your emails, you were coordinating exactly with Duke while you're claiming to be independent leading this board. How do you square that?
So by virtue of doing this work, you have to engage with Duke. It's an advisory board for Duke.
Other emails show Daniels was included in an effort by Duke executives to draft a report for DEQ.
We work with Duke engineers so that everyone is clear on what people think and what that viewpoint is.
On one hand, you're telling DEQ you're totally independent of Duke. You have a board that's run by you, not by Duke Energy. And then you're going and you're helping Duke and its engineers craft its message for DEQ. The average person would look at that and say, that's not independent.
So we're not crafting the message. We're crafting what we believe to be our objective advice on the situation.
Duke has reassured its regulators and the public that everything is fine and has pointed to science and has pointed to scientists, saying these independent scientists have validated our assertions.
DJ Gherkin is a lawyer at the Southern Environmental Law Center. He's part of a team suing Duke over its coal ash ponds.
No, this is not an outside review. This is not an independent scientist, independent of Duke Energy's interests.
The advisory board advises Duke. Of course, we're going to work with Duke and present that activity to DEQ.
Both Daniels and Duke spokeswoman Paige Sheehan say they've done nothing wrong.
What you see in thousands of emails and other documents is the normal give and take that you should see in scientific work. It's exactly what you want to see in scientific work.
We should be looking at these scientists' assumptions carefully because they're working for Duke.
Reporting in Charlotte, Nick Oxner, WBTV, on your side.
We have posted much more of our investigation into the relationship between Duke Energy and professors it hired at UNC Charlotte online on WBTV.com, including some of the documents produced by the university that shows the interactions between Daniels and Duke.